society, lords and ladies, clergy and the poor alike. The dance macabre, a reminder of the universality of death, was a recurrent moral and artistic theme in post-plague Europe. Let's have a look. Right, I'm going to grab my coffee first. Okay. The bubonic plague, that came to be known as the Black Death, spread to Europe from Central Asia, where it had already left a trail of devastation. It may have first reached Europe in the autumn of 1346, when an army of Muslim Tartars laid siege in the flourishing Christian enclave of Kaffa, the modern-day Ukrainian port of Feudalism, on the Silk Road, and plague struck the besieging troops. Stories of infected corpses being catapulted over the walls into Kaffa to spread the plague are probably unreliable. What is not disputed is that infected fleas on rats accompanied the besieged Christian merchants when they fled by boat back to the Mediterranean via Constantinople in 1347, and so they took the bubonic plague with them, thus the most virulent pandemic then known and still ever recorded to man. Now remember, this was written in 2007, spread rapidly and fatally through much of the Western world. Diverse strains. Plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, down here, which is carried by fleas on wild rodents. Transfer of bacterial infection occurs when the fleas feed on human blood. There were 3 variants of the plague: bubonic, in which the patient develops buboes or swellings of the neck, groin or armpit glands, and from which this variant got its name; pneumonic, or blood coughing, in which the lungs are infected because the disease is carried in the air and inhaled; and septicemic, or blood poisoning, in which the bacteria attack the blood system itself. The bubonic variant was the most dramatic and obvious form of Black Death, as described by contemporaries such as the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote of certain swellings in the groin or the armpits, some as large as a common apple. It took 3 to 5 days to incubate, and then within a further 3 days had caused death in 80% of victims. The pneumonic strain, with or without the boils, was 90 to 95% lethal within just a few days. Today, with treatment, that percentage would probably survive, and could be transmitted directly from person to person by sneezing, for example. The septicemic variant, though the least common, led to virtually instantaneous death. This most virulent form also caused a victim's skin to turn dark purple, almost black, and may account for the plague's epithet, black, though this term was not used at the time. Right, just grabbing my coffee again. How many perished under its macabre shadow is not known, but it is estimated that in Europe more than 25 million died from this plague pandemic. Other estimates fear up to 50 million, out of a population of 80 million in the 1300s. The plague returned repeatedly over subsequent generations, but never again with such devastating loss of life. So over here we have the bacterium. It's called Yersinia pestis. Medical researchers have extracted genetic evidence of the DNA code of a sausage-shaped Yersinia pestis bacterium from several some 60,000 lives, a quarter of the population of Athens at that time. First European bubonic plague. From circa 542 CE, a bubonic plague had reached Egypt and the Roman Empire from Arabia. It became known as the Plague of Justinian, after the Emperor Justinian I. Thus, the Black Death was not the first such plague in Europe. Okay, let's have a look at another topic. Medieval Europe. Okay, I'm just going to have a sip of coffee first. So let's see who's in this picture. This is Charlemagne's coronation. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor on Christmas Day 800 CE. Charlemagne said he did not want to be crowned by Leo, perhaps because by giving the emperor the crown, Leo appeared the more powerful of the two. Oh, that's interesting. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe fragmented into many small states in which local leaders took power and in some cases carved out empires for themselves. The Frankish ruler Charlemagne and the Saxon Otto I both held territory that approached the size and power of the Western Roman Empire. The most successful of the new states to emerge in the period after the end of the Western Roman Empire was the kingdom of the Franks. The Franks were a confederacy of Germanic tribes from the area around modern-day Belgium and Holland. Under their leader Clovis, circa 481 to 511 CE, the Franks conquered most of the old Roman province of Gaul and laid the foundation of an empire that would dominate Western Europe for centuries. Significantly for the future of Europe, Clovis also converted to Catholic Christianity, while most of his rivals were Arians, regarded as heretics by the Roman population. In doing so, Clovis ensured that Catholicism, rather than the Arian form of Christianity, would eventually prevail through Western Europe. On his death, Clovis's kingdom was divided among his sons, and it continued to expand in the 6th century under his descendants, known as the Merovingians. The Carolingians, the power of the Frankish kings, declined in the late 7th century. Several died young, and rival aristocratic factions vied for power. One of these families, later known as the Carolingians, emerged as dominant as a result of the alliances with other noble houses made by its head, Pippin II. From 719 to 741 CE, his illegitimate son Charles Martel, the Hammer, controlled the kingdom, ruling in the name of a succession of Merovingian kings. Charles Martel defeated Arab raids from Spain and reimposed Frankish rule east of the Rhine. Anglo-Saxon missionaries such as Saint Boniface were encouraged to set up monasteries and promote conversion in the conquered territories. In 751, Charles Martel's son Pippin III obtained the Pope's approval to depose the last Merovingian king and became the first ruler of the new Carolingian dynasty. and new territories with which to support and expand their own followings. Under Charlemagne, the Franks undertook 30 years of warfare against the pagan Saxon tribes to the east of the Frankish lands, forcefully converting them to Christianity. In 773, invited by Pope Hadrian I to save Rome from conquest by the Lombard, North Italian king Desiderius, Charlemagne invaded northern Italy. Following the capture of the capital, Pavia, he proclaimed himself king of the Lombards. An expedition to the Ebro Valley in Spain in 778 was less successful, but Charlemagne's greatest triumph came in 796 with the collapse of the Avar Empire, centred in modern Hungary as a result of Frankish attacks. He acquired the enormous treasure they had built up over the preceding 3 centuries, which he used to pay for new churches and monasteries, as well as building a new capital at Aachen in western Germany. The Carolingian Renaissance. Contacts with Italy and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms enabled Charlemagne to attract scholars to his court, such as Alcuin of York, the Visigothic poet Theodulf, and the Lombard historian Paul the Deacon. Not only did the Frankish court become a centre of learning to which the leading aristocratic families sent their sons, these and other advisors also helped Charlemagne to carry out a programme of reform of the Frankish Church. This involved importing model texts from Italy, including works of liturgy, church law, monastic rule, and biblical scholarship. Higher levels of literacy were imposed on the clergy, and new laws were issued throughout the reign to counter errors and abuses in the Frankish Church. A reformed and more legible script known as Caroline replaced that used in the Merovingian period, and continued in use throughout Western Europe until the 12th century. In 802 CE, following the failure of 2 rebellions against him, Charlemagne imposed oaths of loyalty on all free men over the age of 12. His subjects swore loyalty to my lord Charles Most. Pious Emperor. This use of oaths to create a direct relationship between ruler and subjects reflects the lack of more complex administrative structures such as had existed in the Roman Empire. Charlemagne made many administrative reforms and created a more efficient bureaucracy than had existed under his predecessors, but he continued to depend on a handful of officials drawn from the local aristocracy. Military action in particular required a large degree of consensus among the nobility. Imperial authority. Charlemagne also sought to develop the imperial dimension of his rule, borrowing from the authority of the Roman emperors. In 800 he went to Rome to reinstate Pope Leo Saxony in eastern Germany grew steadily more powerful. The most successful of them all was Otto I, reigned 936 to 73 CE. Otto benefited from a discovery of silver in the Harz Mountains in Saxony in 938, which gave him the wealth to pay for a huge army and build a string of fortified towns. He pushed the boundaries of his German Empire eastwards, inflicting a major defeat on the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, which is up here. Like Charlemagne before him, Otto cultivated the church, encouraging the conversion of non-Christians in his realm and founding new bishoprics. He appointed his own nominees as abbots and bishops and sought to strengthen the authority of the church at the expense of the secular nobility. Okay. Now down here, let me show you a picture. This is King Alfred, and it says, Alfred the Great inherited the throne of Wessex in southern England in 871 CE. At the Battle of Edington in 878 he defeated the Danes, who had already occupied north and eastern England and were attacking Wessex. Basing his style of rule on that of Charlemagne, he strengthened his kingdom against further attacks, building fortified towns and establishing a navy. Alfred, like Charlemagne, also promoted education and the arts. He left his kingdom much stronger than he found it, and he laid the foundations for his successors to unite England under a single ruler. Okay. So, over here in this box, this is what happened before the waning of the Roman Empire. Over the course of the 5th century CE, military and economic problems led to the Western Roman emperors being unable to exercise direct rule over their provinces. Instead, power was delegated to a series of commanders from beyond the frontiers who established themselves with their followers. Rome lost control of Britain in around 410, southern and western Spain in 413, southwest France in 418, North France and the rest of Spain after 451, and most of the rest of France in 473. Romulus Augustus, the last Roman emperor, was deposed in 476 by Odoacer, leader of the Federation of East Germanic tribes. He was crowned king of Italy. In 961 CE, Otto invaded northern Italy and was crowned emperor by the Pope, John XII, cementing the relationship between the papacy and the emperor of what would later become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Feudalism in Europe. The term feudalism is used to describe the system of relationships between kings and nobles in northern Europe during much of the medieval period. In many ways, it was the same system used by the Carolingian emperors, who appointed noblemen to administer areas of their empire in return for a certain amount of power and land, sealing the relationship with an oath of loyalty. The feudal system that evolved in England and France worked in a similar way to the Carolingian example. The king assigned a parcel of land known as a fief to a nobleman. In return for the land, gives access to a small walled area called the North Barbican, where attackers could be trapped. And then here we have narrow slits. Allow archers to shoot out at attackers. Small windows prevent attackers from climbing in. Battlements protect defending archers and provide a safe refuge. Then we've got the main floors of the Great Tower, contain a ceremonial hall for the king and smaller private rooms. This is the spiral staircase in a corner tower. Leads to storage areas below the castle. The walls of the Great Tower are up to 6.4 metres or 21 feet thick. Wow. That's very thick to protect the royal apartments from attack. The forebuilding and entrance were guarded, acting as a barrier between the lord of the castle and intruders. And the inner bailey walls, or courtyard, housed the hall and other buildings to provide accommodation for the king's household guests and armed garrison. Okay, I'm just going to read this bit before we go. I'm going to grab my tea first. Coffee, even. I don't know when it became tea. Knighthood and chivalry. The medieval knight fitted broadly into this system of feudal obligation, having evolved initially from the heavy cavalry who had accompanied rulers such as Charlemagne. By the 11th century, the knights had come to represent a distinct caste of professional fighting men. Their status was confirmed and enhanced through symbols and public ceremonies, such as the accolade, a girding with a sword or hand on the shoulder. In return for this special status, the knight was expected to fight for his lord and to defend those groups, such as the clergy and the poor, who relied on his protection. The 12th century writer John of Salisbury defined the knight's duties as being to guard the church, to fight unbelievers, to venerate the priesthood, to protect the poor from injuries, to pour out their blood for their brothers. Inevitably, the reality of knightly conduct did not always match up to this chivalric code. Towards the latter part of this period in particular, feudal obligations were superseded by monetary arrangements. By the 14th century, knights would expect to be paid for their service, and could themselves often pay a shield tax in lieu of service. Nonetheless, throughout this period, knights remained a social and military elite. The castle. Castles were the headquarters of the medieval feudal system. A castle was a multi-purpose building. It was the home of a lord, his family, and his servants. It was where business was done. The lord met his vassals, and where courts of justice met. It was also a military base and a fortified building from which a whole region could be defended. Some castles were royal residences. In a period when communications were poor, the best way for a monarch to exercise power in the kingdom was to travel continuously. So rulers usually had castles around their kingdom. Other strongholds were held by vassals on the king's behalf, who ruled as a part of their feudal duties. A castle usually had a courtyard, a bailey, surrounded by a strong